Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is an absolutely gorgeous Tuesday here in Appalachia. The temperatures are comfortable. We were getting some summer-like temperatures the last several days, but today is in the upper 60s, lower 70s. The sun's shining. A little bit stronger breeze than we'd like, but it seems to be almost a permanent feature now here in the mountains. I think that's because we're doing serious damage to the mountains. But anyway, welcome to the program. It is a pleasure to be with you. I thank you for tuning in. If you are tuning in real time, live to today's program, as you obviously know, we're beginning 1/2 hour later than we normally do on Mondays and Wednesdays, and that's what we usually do on Tuesdays. I had a Rotary meeting that doesn't end until 1 o'clock on Tuesdays, and I was telling Bob Kincaid before we went on the air, it was a little bit of an emotional one for me because one of my fast friends, been friends with Robert since I came to Southern West Virginia in 1991. Robert and his wife are leaving the community and moving to Virginia in order to be closer to their son, and they are absolutely vital parts of this community, this particular community. They have done so much. Margaret has been given the Community Service Award for her service to the community and the work she's done to beautify the area and plant flowers and mulch and all of these things and around town, and they'll be missed. And we had a very, very good meeting, a very good turnout, and people just absolutely love them, and so do I. So it was a very positive, pleasant meeting. As Robert said when he made his comments at the end, he feels like he's a witness at his own funeral in a sense. But the fact of the matter is, I had to think realistically as to how many times Robert and I might cross paths again, and that makes me a little bit sad. But on the other hand, I think the fact that everybody in the community was able to express the kind of warmth to him, I think that's very important. Robert is a very, very shy, humble person. And at the same time, he's a very important person for a number of people. Every time you talk to somebody about him, they have a story, and it's a different one because he's helped so many different people in so many different ways. It's exciting to know people like that, to have known and been friends with people like that. Robert sponsored me as a Rotarian in the early 90s, and it's one of the most rewarding memberships and experiences I've had is to be a member of Rotary and have been an officer. I was president for this particular club on 2 different occasions, and I appreciate so much what Robert gave me the opportunity to do and experience, and so it's a little bit of an emotional day for me, but on the other hand, it's a very beautiful day and a very positive one. And I think it continues to be now that we're here together at the Virtual Center, and I thank you for tuning in. We'll be engaged today in a continuation of the issues and the content that we were dealing with yesterday. I hope that's okay. I do solicit your input, your response, your questions, your concerns, your ideas, suggestions, or whatever. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me, and of course the material I'm dealing with both yesterday and today from Richard Sennett is material that Harry, one of our regular listeners, sent to me. And so I would like you to know how very important the connection, the personal connection via email is to me. It's a way that I've gotten to interact with a number of listeners to the program in various places around the nation and even around the world. Obviously, we've had a couple of occasions where Horst has called us from Taiwan. We've had we've had a communication, a couple of communications from Sweden, and it's very, very exciting. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. For those of you who are with us now but were not with us yesterday, I just want to perhaps take a couple of moments at the very beginning of today's program to kind of bring those of you who weren't able to be with us yesterday up to where we are, so that we can move on. I mentioned that Harry, one of our regular listeners from Baltimore, whom we've communicated with several times over in recent weeks because of the situation in Baltimore, Harry called a couple of times. He called, in fact, yesterday at the end of the last 10, 15 minutes of the program, and shared some thoughts with you on Richard Sennett and on some of the material we're dealing with. But Richard Sennett is an established, accomplished sociologist. Obviously, Harry is very, very fond of him. He mentioned that he's taken classes from him, and he feels that he's not the type of sociologist that throws language and lingo around. He's very down to earth, very straightforward, and has a lot to say. And I think that the quotations that he sent me, which I've used and I will continue to use today on our program, bear that out. That this is, it seems to me, very, very significant stuff. The book that we're into now is the book on the New Capitalism, entitled Origins of the New Capitalism, is one that Sennett wrote in 2006. So it's 9 years. It's been in public. It's been out on the market for 9 years. So it's not that old. It's relatively new. The first book that Richard Sennett published was in 1972, and I believe he's published at least six books since then. Harry was citing a couple of citations from a couple of other books. So obviously Harry's very, very knowledgeable about Sennett. He's read much of what Richard Sennett has written. But my point is that it doesn't matter whether you go back into the early 70s or into the 90s, the book he wrote in 98, that Harry cited some quotations from yesterday, or the 2006 books on the structural nature of the new capitalism. The fact of the matter is, this stuff is extremely relevant now. What made me so excited about reading this material is that it's so timely. Many, as we look back now to 3 and 4 decades ago, one has to admire the insight that Richard Sennett sees, how he sees the changes that at that time were just beginning. He sees where this is going, and of course from our vantage point now, we can appreciate the fact that we indeed did go there. We are there. And I think it's very significant, and it gives us a framework or a way to understand some of the things that are happening in our community and some of the assumptions that we make as a society, as a culture, that perhaps cause us to not really see clearly what we're doing and where we're going and how it's affecting people. I think all of this is significant. I think we have an inclination or a tendency to believe that government sees all of this. It doesn't. Those in government don't see all this. I would suggest to you that what makes Richard Sennett significant as a professional, as a sociologist, and a commentator on contemporary society is the fact that what he is saying and what he is allowing us to see is information and material that we wouldn't see without him. But it's there, and once he strings it together for us, we can appreciate, it seems to me, how very, very valuable what he's giving us is to our understanding of the situation and some of the things that are happening around us. But more important, it gives us the kind of foundation we need in order to begin to speculate on ways that we can address some of the negatives associated with this. We're not talking about, turning things around 180 degrees or anything like that. But we're talking about things that perhaps we didn't notice before, or didn't appreciate the significance of before, or didn't believe that, however serious it might be, that we could do anything about it. And I think what Senate is giving us is an opportunity as a society. And when a professional scholar can do that, it seems to me that's the kind of criterion that separates scholarship from a more general sense and the scholar. Because a lot of people are active in scholarship, but that doesn't mean that all of them are scholars. Clearly, Richard Sennett is. What we were looking at yesterday was his book on the nature of what he calls in his title, The New Capitalism. The Culture of the New Capitalism is the title of his book, 2006. And what we were talking about are the changes which occurred over the last couple of decades in Western developed society, in Western capitalism, and the impact and the effect that those changes have had and continue to have on the society we live in, but more importantly on the people that comprise it. And I think all of this is extremely important because it relates to the nature of work. But in order to really appreciate the significance of this material, one must begin to appreciate the value of work beyond the income that jobs provide. That which sustains us, directly sustains us, which is income. And we did a couple of programs, even before Senate came into the picture, we did a couple of programs last week here at the Virtual Center that looked at the issue of work, the elements of what we traditionally associate with the word career. We talked about, if you sit back and reflect for a moment, just close your eyes, put your head back and think for a moment about the word job, and then think about the word career. And spend a little bit of time reflecting on whether in fact there is a difference between them and what that difference might encompass. And what you find is there are things that go along with the development or the establishment of a career that go way beyond the issue of the salary or the income that the job itself creates. And those are the kinds of things that the transition to the so-called new economy might be costing us. Because in the transition, we are losing so many jobs, and we are being confronted with so many people who are unable to find a job or unable to find a job that matches their skills and their talents and their abilities. In other words, they are underemployed. Some people call it semi-employed. Many of them are working part-time. And part of the elements associated with the transition to the new economy that Richard Sennett shares with us are some of the changes involved in this transition and what these changes mean for people, for us as a society. And I think the spark, and it's not just one spark, but the particular spark that that really launched this particular discussion were the demonstrations in Baltimore with the death of Freddie Gray. And when Baltimore began to burn, and the frustrations and anger of so many people became public, became visible to so many of us. And, you know, the question obviously that the media is focusing on is to what extent the police overreacted in all of this, and we know that there are 6 policemen have been indicted in all of this. But the real issue, it seems to me, is the frustration. Yesterday we read a quote from an article that appeared in Sunday's Baltimore Sun that once again Harry was kind enough to share with me via email. And it was a very, very profound, meaningful statement by John Angelos, the president of the Baltimore Orioles. And of course, what really brought him to the fore in this whole thing was the fact that in light of the demonstrations, the Baltimore Orioles made a decision, A, to cancel one night game, B, on the second day, to hold the game in order to not totally disrupt the schedule of games, but to do it in an empty stadium, not allow fans to come in because it was considered to be too dangerous. And so the game was played before an empty stadium. And then at that time, the Tampa Bay Rays were scheduled to come into Baltimore for a 3-game series. And the Orioles made the decision that series should be transitioned to Tampa. And so Baltimore lost the advantage of 3 home games, even though they wore home uniforms and they were considered the home game at Tampa. And a lot of people began to debate whether in fact we should have done that, or whether that was going a little bit too far, or whether it was conceding to the violence and the destruction, and whether in fact we wanted to do that. And at that point, John Angelos, the owner of the Baltimore Orioles, became vocal and began to articulate what he saw as some of the issues, some of the underground, the subtle issues that help explain this kind of violence and this kind of destruction. And specifically, he talked about those in our society responsible for the shipment of hundreds and thousands of good jobs for people in Baltimore that were shipped overseas, and the fact that and the fact that what happened as a result. What happened as a result is that lives were disrupted and ruined. And in reaction to that, people began to protest. The police were on alert and obviously inclined perhaps to overreact. That's what people think happened in the case of Freddie Gray. But there's no question that government and the police have become much more militaristic, much more determined to keep order in the face of the disruption and the disturbances which the loss of these jobs has in large part caused. John Angelos said it when a lot of people would not. We opened the program yesterday with some of his quotations on this, about the loss of those jobs and about the militarization and the threats to the Bill of Rights, to people's freedoms with things like curfews and various other things. In other words, the violence precipitates more violence. And depending on what your inclination, your philosophical inclination is, as to where you put the responsibility for the violence, a lot of people put it on the demonstrators. Angelos puts it on the people that created the conditions that led to the demonstrations. And you can go back to Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, and that's exactly what he talked about. Basically, what he was doing in Birmingham was demonstrating for jobs and civil rights. And it it resulted in violence, the use of dogs, massive arrests. Martin Luther King ended up in the Birmingham jail as a result of this demonstrations. And he points out that many of his fellow ministers accused him of violence. And he basically argued in that letter that to pinpoint the source, the cause of the violence with the demonstrators is to miss the point. And he talked about peaceful civil disobedience and all the rest of it, which we won't go into right now. So consequently, when we began to look at Richard Sennett's material yesterday, we looked at the way that Richard Sennett is characterizing the nature of what he calls the new capitalism. And Sennett points out that there have been major changes in the circumstances that have led to other changes which are responsible for massive dislocation in our society. It's causing significant unemployment and underemployment. It's redefining the role for government. It's redefining the role that we are looking toward government to play in order to address some of these problems. It's looking at the issues associated with the individuals themselves who have been displaced and hurt by all of this. Specifically, and this kind of gets into a little bit of where we were yesterday, Richard Sennett introduces us to a German word called Bildung, B-I-L-D-U-N-G. And Bildung in German defines the process whereby an individual is oriented or introduced or socialized, if you will, into a particular society, into a particular culture. It's the process of education that allows people to belong and conduct or lead what they believe is a meaningful, fruitful life. And in his history of industrialism, he goes back to the 19th and early 20th centuries, and he talks about, obviously, the institutions associated with the Industrial Revolution, and that, obviously, the model is the factory. And the factory required or necessitated certain kinds of repetitive skills, certain kinds of repetitive job activity on the part of workers. We didn't use this word yesterday, but I will today. Many sociologists and psychologists have written and argued about the fact that inherent in the factory system is a process of dehumanization, because people are asked to conduct the same activity over and over and over again. Just think of the assembly line. And there's little creativity, there's little intellectual challenge, and the process can be extremely dehumanizing. Consequently, while part of the Bildung, the process of preparing and orienting and educate people for that kind of life, and think of the mass public education that was intended to prepare the bulk of our people for lives in the factory. And then think of the way our schools are organized, with dividing it into periods, having a start time and an end time for classes. encouraging students to respond to bells, and a system of rewards and punishments which orients young people into the process of timeliness, dependability, accountability, responsibility, self-reliance, and all of these other things associated with working in the factory and working in conjunction with other people doing the same thing you are. Then Richard Sennett points out that in the late 20th century and early in this one, the new capitalism began to take over. A new approach began to infiltrate capitalism. And it was characterized by, Richard Sennett believes, three major changes to capitalism itself. The first one was the emergence of shareholder power. Investors who began to invest heavily in the market, in stocks. Consequently, the result is that the accountability or the responsibility of managers in the factories tended to shift toward being accountable to the shareholders. The priorities of the shareholders became way more important than the priorities of the people that worked in the industry itself. And so consequently, the shareholders began to have power. Decisions were made which affected people's jobs and people's lives based on the wants and the needs and the druthers of shareholders. And specifically associated with this is a second major change, which is the shift in thinking in the corporate world from long-term goals to short-term goals. And the whole nature of investment in the market changed. Because whereas people were encouraged to invest in stocks for the long term and would derive profits from the dividends that successful companies paid, now the emphasis was on short-term returns, profits in the value of the shares themselves. And so consequently, investors began to look more at the buying and selling of shares than at dividends. Consequently, goals, priorities became short-term ones rather than long-term ones. Shareholders looked to companies each quarter to provide a profit. They wanted to see the bottom line numbers quarterly, not long-term. No longer were investors willing to accept a losing quarter or a losing year by saying, well, there'll be a recovery next year. All we need to do is hang on and the market will adjust itself. No longer were investors waiting for that. Their demand for immediate short-term returns was too strong. And so the whole nature of the game changed. And a third factor, which changed it even more, was change in technology, the communications revolution. It became possible for managers and supervisors and CEOs and all the rest of it to manage top-down much more directly, much more efficiently, and much faster by the emergence of phenomena like emails And what that meant was that there was no interpretation at the lower levels of executive memos. We all remember the old stories about how the CEO would issue a memo to department supervisors. The supervisors would call meetings of employees in their particular department, and they would basically share the memo with the supervisors of the various departments, who would then go back to the line employees. And every time you did this, you opened the opportunity for interpretation and variance in the message. Emails made that unnecessary, because now a decision maker could make a decision or change a policy, and immediately everybody that affected would know it, because they would all have the same email. They would all have the same information. Consequently, what this did was create a false sense among managers, I believe, that decisions could be much more efficient and much more effective, and management could be much more efficient and much more effective. Companies were able to move quicker. They were able to change products and make major internal changes much faster. It's turned out, as we look back, that some of these were mistakes. Corporations tended to make big mistakes, but because decisions were being made so quickly, and you didn't have the time for these changes in policies and procedure to work their way through the system and be commented upon or acted upon, decisions almost became instantaneous. The good ones, but also the bad ones. Consequently, the change, and this is what Sennett is talking about, the changes, these three changes in combination, the increasing power in the hands of shareholders, the demand of investors and shareholders for short-term gain, for immediate regular profits, and what that meant for the company, for its policies, for its procedures, for its accountability or responsibilities, for what it meant for relationships between management and labor. It obviously created an environment when workers believed that they probably needed some sort of union representation, some sort of organization at the lower level in order to be effective. But it also meant that the new corporation, the modern corporation, needed to be more mobile, more flexible. And so the idea of sitting down with representatives of employees, union representatives, discussing policy and procedures and negotiating long-term salaries and wages and fringe benefits and health care and all the other things that these kinds of negotiations always focused upon, was seen by the changing corporation as being negative. And so, in a sense, a definition of the ideal employee in this new working environment began to materialize. And the elements of what used to be considered the ideal employee or the ideal person began to change. And whereas the worker used to see security and stability in the workplace as a given, once you got a job and secured it and established yourself, you were guaranteed certain things. Guaranteed a job, guaranteed a stable salary, a pension when you retired, and all the rest of it. All of this security, all of this stability began to change as focus on the corporation's bottom line began to be more and more concentrated. the more people looked at the bottom line, the more flexibility companies believed they needed. The more in the way unions became. The more alien the idea of sitting down and negotiating with workers became to the process. And increasingly, companies began to look for ways to change attitudes, to change behavior. In other words, the Bildung itself changed. The process whereby people are educated and introduced into the system of the new capitalism began to change. The priorities began to change. Whereas the traditional industrial system used to put a premium on experience and commitment to the company and commitment to the goals of the company, the new capitalism began to put the emphasis on things quite different. The emphasis in the new company is on flexibility, mobility, skills development. The traditional argument that we've heard over the last several years is the argument that working people will change careers 5, 6, 7 times during the course of their working life. In other words, the emphasis is placed on freedom. Employees are encouraged to surrender pensions in the interests of stock investments, IRAs, control of their own retirement plans, which would give them the freedom to move from job to job, company to company, and be able to take their retirement program with them. Because their investments in their own retirement would be property. It would be their property. It would be their commodities. No longer would their retirement be done in conjunction with the company. Now their retirement was a separate thing. But the other side of that, of course, is that with this change, many companies were able to shelve, to scuttle, the traditional idea of investing in employee pensions and employee retirements. In many cases, once your retirement became yours, it also became your responsibility. In other words, what you had, what you were worth when you retired was totally up to how much you put in it. The employer had little, if anything, to do with that. So in a sense, these kinds of changes relieved corporations, relieved employers of responsibility for the retirement status of their own employees. And the emphasis was on freedom and flexibility and mobility. And that becomes the mechanism or the ingredient, if you will, of the new Bildung. And that seems to me what Richard Sennett is talking about, is that the dislocation associated with these kinds of changes is having a very detrimental effect on people. It's rendering large numbers of people as excess, as dispensable, as useless, as unable to contribute anything to the enterprise, whatever it happens to be. In other words, if you are identified as being able, not being able to bring anything meaningful to the workplace, then you become expendable. You become invisible. You become part of the mass. So the irony is, as we put more and more emphasis on the skills, on building skills, especially technological skills, because we are in the midst of a technological revolution, as that becomes the basic focus of emphasis, then what we begin to see is more and more people being rendered useless, being rendered as baggage, being rendered as insignificant. And so what we really see, and I think this is about where we ended yesterday, what we really see, it seems to me, is a major disconnect between the priorities of corporations, the priorities of the new capitalism, and the realities of those forced to work and survive within it. The more we can understand this, and I realize that we've been here 40 minutes now, and that constitutes review. And I apologize for an extensive review like that. But if there are people who are tuning in that weren't with us yesterday, I think this is really significant, because the point I'm going to make, the more we can understand and appreciate the interworkings of this kind of a system, these kinds of interactions, the more we can understand some of the dislocation and some of the problems that we see all around us. But even more important than that, it gives us an opportunity perhaps to do something about them, because at least we understand what's happening. Most of these issues are really worthy of discussion and reflection. So I'm really encouraging folks, those of you listening, to spend some time on this. I mean, once today's program is over, it'll be available in podcast. It'll be available in the archives. Go back and listen again. Reflect upon some of the ingredients, some of the things that Richard Sennett is telling us about the nature of the changes in society we are facing. And then begin to speculate from your own perspective as to how you can navigate this, how you can prepare your kids to navigate this, how we as a society can help prepare your kids to navigate this. If the changes between the Bildung that seems to be a priority now and the Bildung that used to reward experience and dedication and learning by mistakes, the kinds of elements or issues that we believe contribute to the concept of craftsmanship. Think of the idea of craftsmanship. Think of what craftsmanship means. And think of what the craftsman must do and must learn in order to become a craftsman. Basically, one does not get out of school with a degree, graduate from college with high school with a diploma, or college with a degree or an associate degree, and immediately qualify as a craftsman. In effect, a craftsman is a kind of an artist, a skilled specialist, a person who knows the field better than anybody, an expert, someone whose work is so respected that this person's skills and dedication and creativity are appreciated more than other people in the field. Think of craftsmen. And think of what's necessary in order to become a craftsman in whatever you do. There was a story in our local paper here this past Sunday about a craftsman in wood. who's in his mid-50s, has never taken, except for a class in middle school, a middle school woodworking class, has never taken a formal class in woodworking, but from the very beginning was taken with the idea of what one could do with wood. And as I read this piece in Sunday's paper, the author of the interviews that went into this story, how this wood craftsman talked about the emotional experience, the sensations, the interaction. This man actually talked about communicating with wood. That's so sensitive and so sharp was his sensitivity to the different species of wood, different kinds of wood, that he actually said when he holds it in his hands, he can actually experience the wood communicating with him through his fingers. You don't graduate from school being able to do that. That's something you acquire over many years. He talked about making dulcimers. He makes dulcimers. He talked about the fact that it just so happened that the person he took woodworking from in middle school made and played dulcimers. And that experience fired him up to the point that even though he tried different things, kept coming back because that was the only thing that he really got excited about. And so, as he points out now, his wife is I believe, a teacher, and I believe she has a regular fixed salary as such. He works part-time jobs and does various kinds of part-time jobs because he spends so much time working with woods and making dulcimers and making doll houses for children and those kinds of things out of wood. He's not making it for the income. He's making it for the pleasure and the experience and the fact that the people who get to enjoy what he produces give him the kind of feedback that as a craftsman he cherishes. That's the kind of attitude toward work that all of us, but the new capitalism discourages that. In the new capitalism, there's no time for that. If you insist on spending your time on one piece, or with one customer or one client, or in a call center, if you spend too much time on one particular call, then you are usually called on the carpet for that. Because the issue is flexibility and speed, and the idea that you have the kind of flexibility and the kind of talent that allows you to move from one experience to the other, which requires one set of skills and then possibly in due time another set of skills. And that kind of mobility and that kind of flexibility and that kind of intuition and ability to adjust and work with different people in different settings, those things become the priorities or the ingredients of the new Bildung. There ain't no room in that for craftsmanship. There's no room in that for pride or appreciation in what you do. Once the Industrial Revolution happened, once industrialism made it possible to mass produce things that used to be made by hand by craftsmen, then the nature of craftsmanship itself had to change. This idea of people actually communicating with the wood was no longer possible if you worked in an assembly line. Making toys or machines or furniture or whatever that came with some assembly required. In other words, you worked on the pieces that became part of the whole. As a worker, you never even experienced the whole. If you worked on an assembly line in an automobile plant, you probably put the wing nuts, as it were, on wheels. Or you may paint the fenders. Or you may polish up the bumpers. But it becomes very difficult to take pride in the car. Because in your work, you never see the car as car. You see only pieces of it. And so, in a sense, the whole system works against your idea or possibility of considering yourself a craftsman in any way. Because you don't have the opportunity to interact with the final product. The man who makes dulcimers does. But that didn't destroy craftsmanship, because increasingly what people did became increasingly identified with what they made. People began to take pride in their job, whatever it was. And part of the Bildung of industrialism was encouraging people to take pride in what they did. And so consequently, Richard Sennett talks about those people who clean buildings, clean offices. But they take pride that at the end of the night, when they go home at midnight, that place is clean. Those desks are clean. Those restrooms are clean. The place where employees are going to come in and make coffee in the morning are clean. And these people take pride in that. So in a sense, there's somewhat of a change in the I believe in the definition of craftsmanship. Craftsmanship is no longer defined by the interaction of the person who makes it and the item which you make. Increasingly, craftsmanship is increasingly focused on the product itself and your ability to take pride on what you contributed to making or cleaning or doing. Whether you sew, whether you stitch, whether you work with wood, whether you work with metal, whatever you sheet metal, whatever you do, you take pride in what you do. In other words, craftsmanship is increasingly objectified. It's entirely contained within the object itself, rather than your interaction with it. But it's craftsmanship, and it's pride. And people can feel good about what they do. How many times I've heard this numerous times. How many times have you talked to people that say, nobody really appreciates what I do, they don't even notice me. But the fact of the matter is, it's very important to me that when I'm done, you know, when I cook a meal, and I work in a restaurant, and when I cook a meal and I put it out there, I want it to be a meal that I would be very, very proud and comfortable having my own children sit down to enjoy. I take pride in what I send out on the plates that I put together for customers in this restaurant. And employers want that, need that. But employees do too. Employees have to have that sense of meaningfulness, usefulness, pride in what they do. But the new capitalism discourages even that. Because in order to do well what you do, takes time. And the one thing that new capitalism doesn't have a lot of is time. You are evaluated and held accountable based on your efficiency and your overall production. Granted, you're going to be penalized for putting out a product that is inferior. But given the sophistication of technology, that doesn't become a problem anymore. Technology takes care of all the details. We need you to run it and operate it and be accountable for it and be efficient. We measure you on your productivity. We measure you on your ability to work with other people, with teams. We measure you or evaluate you on your ability to work with one group and then go and work with another group and then work with another group. In other words, what you are telling us, what you are showing us is your mobility, your flexibility, your team building skills, your ability to work in groups, the fact that you don't need to be massaged. You don't need your ego massaged. There's no place in the system for that. You know, one of the things the more I think of this, and I'm thumbing through Richard Sennett's material here because it seems to me in one of the paragraphs we looked at, that tends to be just hang on for a moment. I apologize. I should have marked this. My problem is I marked so much that I'm awash in marks, if that makes sense. So I'm struck by a friend of mine in graduate school one time who watched me underlining a textbook in a graduate history class. And I was using a highlighter, a yellow highlighter, and I practically highlighted the whole page. And this friend of mine, a fellow graduate student of mine, came in late one night. It was a Saturday night. I was preparing for a final exam Monday morning, and he came in and peered over my shoulder and looked at the page that I had yellowed and made a comment. He was from Texas, from western Texas. I'll never forget. And he said, "O'Brien, why don't you use a damn paintbrush?" And basically what he was telling me is if you highlight everything, then you lose the effect of highlighting. And of course what that was indicating to me is it all seemed so important to me that I couldn't separate or distinguish the important from the unimportant. One of the things I've learned about teaching over the years is that that's a difficult skill for students, is knowing what to underline or what to highlight. I still have that problem. Let me share one paragraph that Richard Sennett has about, which is about automation, about the impact of technology on job displacement, on costing jobs. And Richard Sennett said, automation has affected the bureaucratic pyramid in a profound way, both in manual work and in white-collar work. Organizations can now efficiently shed routine jobs thanks to such innovation as barcode readers, voice recognition technologies, three-dimensional object scanners, as well as micro machines that do the work of fingers. In other words, what Sennett is pointing out is, traditionally we've always believed that automation and innovation and technology displaces workers. We know that it does. Traditionally, however, displaced workers can go to another place. Now what we have is that automation and technology have reached the point in the new capitalism where automation really is costing significant numbers of jobs. And it's the focus on efficiency and the bottom line that does that. And he gives this example with automation, and I think it's very significant. He says, here are two examples of how automation delivers productivity gains at the same time it costs jobs. From 1998 to 2002, in that 4-year period, the Sprint Corporation increased its productivity 15% by using advanced voice recognition software and increased its revenues year on year 4.3%, while cutting its payroll over this 4-year period by 11,500 workers. All of us have seen examples of this, but here are some hard numbers. One corporation in a 4-year period, the Sprint Corporation, increased productivity 15%, increased revenues on an average year by year 4.3%, and was able to shed 11,500 workers in the process. That is major displacement. But it's displacement driven by the bottom line. Clearly, the fact that the company was able to experience revenue increases of 4.3% per year is in large part because of the layoffs, because of the people that the company was able to get rid of without losing productivity. Another example, this one in heavy industry, steel. From 1982 to 2002, 20-year period, 82 to 2002, steel production in the United States rose from 75 million tons to 102 million tons, even as the number of steel workers dropped from 289,000 to 74,000. So in a 20-year period, the number of steel workers working in the United States steel industry declined from 289,000 to 74,000. 215,000 jobs in 20 years. Here in West Virginia, we are in the midst, all of Appalachia is, in the midst of this so-called war on coal that the coal industry here is pinning on the EPA and on the Obama administration. And the argument is that unreasonable EPA standards imposed from Washington are placing impossible goals, impossible barriers on coal production. There's no way that coal companies can meet standards which keep moving up and up and up on air quality. And of course the reason for that is coal is dirty by definition. In spite of the fact that there's all of this talk about clean coal, the fact of the matter is it's much easier to talk about than it is to deliver on. The fact of the matter is, however, the EPA in the war on coal is not the culprit in the decline of coal jobs. Technology is. Mountaintop removal is. the number of miners that you needed to employ in order to go underground and extract coal was significant. The number of people, employees that you need to blow the top off of a mountain and use heavy equipment to mine the coal that is unearthed is minimal. Here in the state of West Virginia now, the latest estimate I've seen, is that there are about 16,000 West Virginia citizens working in the coal industry. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan was elected president, jobs in West Virginia coal topped 125,000. 125,000 jobs in 1980, 16,000 plus today. The EPA didn't cause that. This is what caused that. So I really believe that what Rich's Senate has given us is some important, meaningful information and insight and some very positive and important concepts. When I say positive, I don't mean positive in a good sense. I mean positive in the sense that once we know what they are, we can deal with them. Like everybody else, maybe a little bit more than everybody else, I'm obviously knee-deep in the deflate gate. That was a thing in my throat. I'm not emotional over this. In the situation with Tom Brady and the New England Patriots. I'm a Patriots fan. I'm a Brady fan. I grew up in Massachusetts. I'll always be a Patriot fan. But that's neither here nor there. So therefore, I have my feelings in this as well as other people do as well. However, if I can stand back a little bit and hold this stuff all at arm's length and look at what we are seeing in this, what we are seeing, it seems to me, is an incredible story. We are seeing a situation where an incredible number of people in a world which is threatened by terrorism, in a world that just has experienced one of the most horrendous earthquakes in history, we are looking at a nation that is experiencing some of the most deadly weather-related destruction and death that we've ever experienced as we continue to kick back and forth the idea of climate control and climate change and all the rest of it, all the other things that may or may not be associated with us. While all of those things are going on, the nation is absolutely mesmerized by deflated footballs. I wonder what that tells us. One of the things that always, as a historian, one of the things that always impressed me and amazed me was the social and cultural side of historical development. The extent to which one could see society's priorities reflected in how people spent their time, not only their working time, that's what we've been talking about, but also their leisure time. I'm not the first one. This is not, I can't tell you where or who, which historian, I couldn't footnote this because I can't even remember where I first picked it up. But once this occurred to me years and years ago, I became absolutely infatuated with the extent to which athletics, sports, grew and became more and more popular at the height of the Industrial Revolution in America. And more I began to appreciate the extent to which games, athletics, entertained, captivated, and kept interested working people in industry. And then I began to associate this with the idea of the dehumanization we talked about earlier. And what I began to conjure up in my mind is a theme or a thesis. And all of that seems to come together in the word Richard Sennett introduces to us, which is Bildung. It seemed to me that people as living, breathing human beings could not live a work life, continue to exist in a working world in which their creativity was discouraged, that talents went unrecognized and unrewarded. It seemed to me that society's response to people whose human qualities were being repressed was to find ways to entertain them, just as the Romans used to come to the Colosseums in order to attend the games. And this was part of leadership. This was part of government's ability and responsibility to lead and provide for the public interest. The public interest at the height of industrialism, at the height of the factory system, and at the height of the Bildung process, which oriented people into that factory system, was the need to provide positive entertainment in their leisure time. And increasingly, society began to define acceptable uses of leisure. One of the most enlightening pieces of historical evidence I ever saw in my life was the publication by the U.S. Department of Education at the end, not the Department of Education, the National Education Association, the NEA, at the end of World War I in 1917, on what are called the 7 cardinal principles of education in America. Here is the group, the professional organization that speaks for the nation's educators, laying out the principal goals, the principal objectives of K through 12 education in America, in an America of 1917. In an America which has just witnessed a horrendous world war. In an America that is overwhelmed with increasing numbers of immigrants who have come to this country for the industrial jobs that the country promised. And so the educational spokesmen and leaders of the nation get together and they redefine and clarify for all to see the cardinal principles of education. And one of them, I believe it's the fourth one, is, and this is a quote, the worthy use of leisure time. The worthy use of leisure time. For a long time, I had trouble with that one until I connected it with industrialism. Until I connected it with society's responsibility to maintain an environment that was stable and secure and peaceful in a world where individuals were dehumanized by the way they spent their working lives. And increasingly, I began to look as a historian for ways that society sought to fill the void by contributing to the introduction and the creation of activities, events, and policies that would qualify as the worthy use of leisure time. And there's no way that one can look at the growth and expansion of professional and college-level sports and high school sports in this country without recognizing the cultural benefits that it provides in a society. It literally takes people's attention off the bad stuff, the important stuff. An awful lot of what government is able to do and get away with, an awful lot of what the private sector is able to do and get away with, is due in large part to the fact that so many of our people are fixated on sports, on athletics, on things that really, in the big picture, don't matter all that much. However, one of the things I'm seeing now with the salaries that athletics makes available to the most talented is the sense that professional sports and professional athletics has become something more in today's world than it was in the industrial world. It has become a key ingredient in the whole process of social mobility. Next to a winning Powerball ticket, athletic skill is the ticket out and up for a lot of people that would never make it otherwise. And the extent to which the media's coverage of, 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, round-the-clock coverage of professional athletics mesmerizes people and captivates people. And I'll admit I'm pretty much hooked on a lot of this stuff myself. I think it's extremely meaningful because it suggests some of today's priorities and how they have changed from previous priorities. For one thing, the salaries seem to demand an increase in ticket prices that result in the fact that those at the bottom, the so-called masses, for whom athletics always was the outlet can't afford to attend anymore. I know people, I was one. I know people who attend games all year long until the playoffs comes, and then they can't get a ticket. Because the tickets are being bought up by corporations and, law firms and hospitals and all of this stuff. And so what we have as an experience, in our nation is an experience where public professional sports, other than for the athlete himself or herself, can only be appreciated and experienced by the very well-to-do. So it's almost becoming out of the reach, except for what the media is able to provide. A word that we hear thrown around all the time, and I realize we're getting close to the time. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left in our program today. One of the words that I hear thrown around all the time in discussion is the idea of those that the media refers to as millennials, young people, those that have been born just before or just after the year 2000. In the 90s, the 1990s and early 21st century. And how they differ and how their priorities differ from the previous generation. One of the things that I noticed, and I think this is very significant, is that there seems to be a cultural change. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because the ingredients of this change mirror almost exactly the priorities of the new capitalism. Just as the new capitalism seems to work against the interests of craftsmanship, so we see the new millennials who don't seem to be collectors of anything. They don't seem to value trinkets. It used to be when I was growing up, and I think everybody, those of you out there can go along with some of this. We used to collect things, whether it was baseball cards or whether it was cap guns or whether it was magic rings from our favorite radio program, if you can go back that far. I'll never forget sending in for Cheerios box tops and getting a Lone Ranger ring with a gun mounted on top that actually, when you spun the wheel, you put a flint in it and it actually sparked. I can also remember from one, and I can't remember where this came from, getting a ring that was that was shaped in the form of a saddle, a horse's saddle. And under that saddle, it glowed in the dark. And under that saddle, you could slide film strips, and you could watch, as you could slide that film strip through under the ring in the dark, and you could actually see or watch a story. And we collected those. One of the most popular programs today on public broadcasting is the Antiques Roadshow, where people are finding things that have been stored in their attics and how much they're worth and all of that. The point is, previous generations were collectors. They were hoarders. They valued things. And they collected things, photographs, albums, mementos, property, for example. But when you listen to discussion about millennials today, they don't seem to collect anything. They don't. One of the things that I've noticed in the last few years I was teaching is that young people today don't have watches. Their cell phone, they get the time from the cell phones, and so people don't have watches anymore. And so basically, people don't collect. They don't value things. And it ties very well with the new capitalism's emphasis and priority on flexibility and mobility. Not being tied down, maintaining maximum freedom, the ability to move and the ability to respond on a dime to a new situation or a new opportunity. And so you can't afford to be chained down or anchored by houses, by homes, property, things, wives. I mean, how many of today's young people live together but never marry? And it's almost seen as being unnecessary. All marriage does is restrict your options, your flexibility. My point is that the priorities of the new capitalism as defined and described by Richard Sennett mirror almost exactly the priorities and the inclinations and the character traits of today's millennials. Their priorities are the priorities of the new capitalism. The mobility, the flexibility, and all the rest of it. I need to say, because we're right almost at the end of our program, we're at 56 minutes after, so we've only got a couple of minutes left. I've got to say that we have not begun to exhaust this topic. There is more. There is the issue of uselessness that is associated with the new capitalism. There is the issue of aging, the management of aging, an aging population. How do we deal with the fact that we are growing older, yet we are raising a younger generation that feels less and less tolerant, less and less willingness to support the elderly, to sustain the elderly, to support or take care of their parents or their grandparents? How many times do we hear people talk about being over the hill or worrying about their skills becoming outdated or their talents becoming outdated? I'm going to have to change professions. I'm going to have to change jobs. I'm going to have to go back to school and become something else because the world is changing and I've got to change with it. And in that mindset, in that frame of mind, the idea of experience and stability and age and wisdom, the idea that in the traditional Native American cultures, when the leaders of the tribe sat around the campfire, it was the old guys that always made the decisions. It was the old people that were respected and revered because of their experience and their wisdom. In the new capitalism, there's no room for the old guys. It seems to me that in our program tomorrow, we have to begin to put a lot of this together, and we have to begin to speculate on solutions. However, I think our day together is over. It's 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for tuning into the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I recognize we didn't take a break today because we did start a half hour late. I appreciate your willingness to tune in. I invite you to tune back tomorrow, same time. Actually, not the same time. We'll be beginning at 1 half hour earlier than we did today, tomorrow. And we'll continue and hopefully complete this material by Richard Sennett. This is Bill O'Brien for the Virtual Center, thanking you so much for listening. Please have a wonderful evening. Be safe. Thank you.